The moment I opened the door, I knew I should have said no. Not because of him, but because of me. Ethan stood there, rain dripping from his hair. That crooked half-smile he always had when he knew he was trouble. "Car broke down a few streets away," he said, voice low. "Mind if I crash here tonight?" Every sensible part of me screamed to tell him there was a hotel 2 blocks away. But my husband was in Denver for a conference. The house was too quiet. And Ethan had always been the one man who made my pulse misbehave. We hadn't worked together in years, but the unspoken pull between us had never really gone away. At the office, it was in the stolen glances, the way his hand would linger a fraction too long when passing me something. We'd never acted on it, but the undercurrent was always there, steady, dangerous. I stepped aside and let him in. He brushed past me, carrying the scent of rain and that faint warm spice he always wore. My fingers twitched at my side, like they remembered him before my mind could. "I'll just take the couch," he said, shaking off his jacket. But the way his eyes held mine told me he wasn't here for the couch. And deep down, I already knew I wasn't going to keep my distance. There's a moment when you can still turn back, before a choice becomes inevitable. I felt it as I handed him a towel. My fingertips grazed his palm, and he didn't let go. Ethan and I first met 5 years ago when I started at the marketing firm. He was the kind of man who made meetings feel like conversations and deadlines feel like adventures. People liked him instantly. I tried not to, but I failed. We were never close in the way people could point at. We didn't have inside jokes or whispered hallway chats. Instead, it was subtler. The way his eyes would find me during a presentation. How he'd pause just long enough when handing me a report, as if testing if I'd notice. I always noticed. We both had our lives. I was newly married then, and he had a girlfriend he never talked much about. There was no reason for lines to blur. Except for the fact that every time we were alone, the air felt different. Thicker. I thought about that the night we almost kissed in the office kitchen. It was late, we were the last ones there, and I'd been struggling with a project. He'd stood behind me, looking at my screen over my shoulder, his voice low as he offered a suggestion. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it. I turned my head, and for half a second our lips hovered in the same breath. Then my phone rang and the spell broke. We never mentioned it. After I left the firm, we didn't keep in touch, not really. A like here, a comment there on social media. Until 2 weeks ago when he messaged me out of nowhere. "Hey stranger. Heard your husband's traveling a lot these days." I'd laughed at the casual boldness. I should have wondered how he knew. Now, standing in my hallway with his damp jacket in my hands, it hit me. He hadn't just happened to be in my neighborhood tonight. This was planned. The rain kept hitting the windows, soft but steady, like it was trying to keep us inside. Ethan settled onto the couch while I went to the kitchen, pretending to be a good host, pretending my hands weren't shaking. "Want something to drink?" I called. "Whatever you're having," he answered. I poured 2 glasses of red wine, wondering if I was making it too easy for him, or for me. When I brought them back, he was leaning against the arm of the couch, his shirt clinging in places from the damp, the fabric outlining just enough to make my breath falter. Our fingers brushed again as I handed him the glass. He didn't move away this time. Instead, he held my gaze for 1 to 3 seconds longer than was polite. "So, Denver, huh?" he said, taking a slow sip. "Your husband gone for long?" The way he said it, not as a question but as a confirmation, made my skin prickle. I laughed, trying to sound casual. "Back tomorrow night." He set his glass down. "Plenty of time then." I didn't know if he meant it as a joke, but my heart reacted as if it wasn't. I sat in the armchair across from him, crossing my legs, keeping a careful distance. But every time he spoke, my body leaned toward his voice without permission. The conversation slid easily between catching up and testing boundaries. His eyes would drift to my mouth when I spoke. I found myself watching the curve of his throat when he tilted his head back to drink. And under it all, I felt the shift. That slow, dangerous gravity pulling us toward the point of no return. We ended up side by side on the couch without really deciding to. I'd brought over a blanket under the excuse that he might be cold, and somehow it draped over both our legs. The movie I'd put on was just background noise. Neither of us was really watching. My arm rested on the back of the couch, close enough that my fingers could feel the heat radiating from his shoulder. At one point he shifted slightly, his thigh brushing mine. Just a small movement. Harmless. But my pulse caught in my throat. "Do you ever think about it?" he asked suddenly, eyes still on the screen. I swallowed. "About what?" "That night, in the office kitchen." The memory flickered instantly. The dim light, the smell of coffee, the way his breath had been so close I'd felt it against my cheek. "Sometimes," I admitted, voice barely above a whisper. He turned then, his eyes locking onto mine, steady and unblinking. "Me too." The room felt smaller. My breath shallowed. One tiny movement and the space between us could disappear. But neither of us moved. Not yet. Instead, I stood to top off our wine, my hands trembling as I poured. When I came back, I sat closer than before. Close enough that the blanket now rested over both of us without any effort. Close enough that my knee pressed lightly against his. It wasn't a kiss. It wasn't crossing the line. But it was the moment we both knew we would. By the time the credits rolled, the rain had stopped, but neither of us moved to get up. The house was hushed, that deep, heavy quiet that comes after a storm. Ethan stretched, his arm brushing mine under the blanket. I didn't pull away. I couldn't. My skin felt alive, like it was waiting for something to happen. "Thanks for letting me stay," he murmured, but there was something in his tone, less gratitude, more intent. He shifted to face me fully, his knee pressing into mine. We were close enough now that I could feel the heat of him, the faint movement of his breath. I tried to look away. I failed. "You know," he said softly, "I didn't just happen to be in the neighborhood tonight." I swallowed, my heartbeat drumming in my ears. "I figured." His smile was slow, almost a confession. "I knew he was gone. I've known for weeks." The words should have made me push him away. Instead, they set something loose inside me. A mix of shock, anger, and an ache I didn't want to name. He leaned in slightly, not enough to touch, but enough to erase any question of where this was going. "Tell me to stop," he said. I didn't. The blanket slipped lower, and suddenly the air between us was so charged I felt dizzy. His hand was on the couch cushion beside my hip, close enough that the edge of his fingers grazed me when I breathed. One move, 1 second, and there would be no going back. The silence between us wasn't empty. It was thick, humming, like the air before lightning strikes. Ethan's eyes stayed locked on mine, searching, daring. I felt my chest rise and fall faster, my body leaning forward without me realizing it. When his fingers finally brushed the side of my hand, it was like every nerve woke up at once. I didn't pull away. He let his touch linger, sliding slowly until his palm covered mine. The warmth of it made my breath catch. Then, almost imperceptibly, he closed the distance. Not all the way, just enough so that his forehead rested lightly against mine. I could feel the heat of his breath, the faint tremor in the way he exhaled. My hands moved instinctively, finding the edge of his shirt, the damp fabric cool under my fingertips. The world outside didn't exist. There was only the nearness, the steady thrum of my heartbeat, and the quiet, unspoken understanding that we had both already decided. When his lips finally found mine, it wasn't rushed. It was slow, deliberate, like we were savoring the exact moment our restraint snapped. I felt my back sink into the couch, his hand cupping my cheek with a tenderness that made the room spin. Every touch was careful but hungry, his fingertips mapping the curve of my jaw, the line of my neck. The blanket slid to the floor. The air around us felt warmer. He whispered my name like it was both a question and an answer, and I answered without words. For a long moment we stayed tangled in that charged quiet, my head resting against his shoulder, his hand still at the curve of my waist. The rhythm of his breathing was steady now, but mine was a mess, uneven, guilty, and reluctant to let go. I don't know who pulled back first, but when we did, the space between us felt too large, like something had been ripped out of the air. His eyes searched mine for what? Regret? Permission? My mind scrambled to catch up with what my body had just done. My husband's face flickered in my thoughts. Not vividly, just enough to make my stomach knot. "We shouldn't have," I whispered. Sounded weak even to me. Ethan's mouth curved, not in amusement but in knowing. "You're saying that now." I stood, gathering the blanket from the floor, more for something to do than out of modesty. My hands were still shaking. "This doesn't happen again," I said, even though some reckless part of me already knew I was lying. He leaned back into the couch, stretching like a man entirely at ease, but his eyes never left mine. "Sure," he said, but his tone told me he didn't believe me either. The house felt colder now. I busied myself in the kitchen, rinsing glasses we hadn't finished, as if soap and water could wash away what we'd just done. When I returned, he was watching me, not with guilt, not even with triumph, but with the calm certainty of someone who knows a door, once opened, will be walked through again. I told him good night and left him on the couch, the blanket folded neatly at his side. My bedroom door stayed closed, but I didn't lock it. I told myself it was because I didn't expect him to try anything else. Lying there in the dark, I could hear him moving in the living room, the soft creak of the couch cushions, the faint clink of his glass on the coffee table. I thought I'd drift off eventually, but my body was still restless, humming with the aftershocks of what we'd done. Then came the soft knock. I didn't answer, and after a few seconds, the sound of footsteps retreated. My chest tightened with both relief and disappointment. In the morning, I found him in the kitchen, leaning casually against the counter, coffee already brewing. He looked as though he belonged there, too much so. "Sleep well?" he asked, his tone light, but there was something in his eyes, a secret we were now co-conspirators in. Before I could respond, my phone buzzed on the counter. A text from my husband. "Flight got cancelled. I'll be home tonight instead." My stomach dropped. I glanced up at Ethan. He was already smirking, as if he knew exactly what the message said without having to ask. He stepped closer, close enough that only I could hear when he murmured, "Guess we've got one more night." And just like that, every promise I'd made to myself the night before felt paper thin. That night I set the table for 3, telling myself it was because I didn't want to make my husband suspicious. Ethan lounged in the living room, the faint sound of his voice on a call drifting into the kitchen. I couldn't hear the words, but the low, confident tone made me wonder who was on the other end, and whether they knew he was here. Every so often I'd catch him watching me, not staring, just waiting, like he was timing something I couldn't see. When my husband finally walked through the door, his arms went around me, warm and familiar. I smiled like nothing was wrong, like my pulse wasn't pounding from the sight of Ethan leaning casually against the doorway, hands in his pockets, eyes locked on mine over my husband's shoulder. No one said anything. Dinner was polite, even pleasant. But when I cleared the plates, Ethan followed me into the kitchen. He reached past me for a glass, his arm brushing mine in a way that was too deliberate to be an accident. My husband was just a few steps away, talking about his delayed flight, completely unaware. Ethan leaned in, close enough that I could feel the heat of his breath at my ear. "This isn't over," he whispered. "And the worst part, the part I'll never admit to anyone, is that I didn't want it to be."